Hi, I'm Tatum Hunter, a technology reporter at the Washington Post. We're kicking off today's conversations by talking about gender equity and representation in the C-suite. Joining me to do this is Padmasree Warrior, founder, president, and CEO of Fable. Hi,
Hi,
Padmasree, how's it going?
good. How are you doing, Tatum?
Doing well. Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it. It's an important topic, isn't it?
Absolutely. So, how often would you say that you talk about this topic? And when you do, where are you usually?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like we talk about it more than I would like to, but at the same time, I feel it is an important topic to talk about. So I am usually at various conferences, sometimes in board meetings, sometimes at events that are promoting diversity and inclusion to encourage others to talk about it and be open and lend their voice and lend their support to the movement that we hope we are driving. So yeah, I think it is a conversation that I have often.
And how does the conversation differ when you're on a panel or at a conference, compared to like when you're with your girlfriends, or when you're with like mentors, mentees, or trusted women colleagues?
Yeah, I think usually if I'm at a conference, I'm talking about my own experiences, what I have learned. It's more, I would say, sharing my journey, what I have learned, in the hope that it might help others go through their journey and make it maybe more seamless than I have had. Maybe be better equipped to deal with the barriers that we all face in our careers. I think it's usually that context if I'm talking to people at conferences and in talking about the importance of having representation in the C-suite, but actually all along the pipeline inside tech companies. If I'm just talking to a bunch of friends and we are debating this issue, I would say it's more likely we are collaborating on what we could do better, what we could have done different in our own experiences. It tends to be more about what could we have done better and what are we each doing to drive this forward, whereas at conferences more sharing my experiences, I would say.
Totally. And and I like that you kicked that off by saying I talk about it more than I'd like to, because it's also like I think that we have done a lot of talking in the last few years about how it is emotional labor, to think about these issues and to talk about them. And I think most people who are directly affected, I bet, are like, I'd love to never talk about this again.
I know it's both that, and I also feel like it's important we should talk about it, but it's also unfortunate that we have to talk about it. I wish we had made so much more progress that we don't need to bring this up as if it's a problem that we need to solve, and I think it versus like it's something we should just do. But we are not there yet, and therefore it is important to talk about it, and it's important to discuss it. It's important to put this issue front and center for everyone. But part of me is like, why is this even an issue? Why are we even talking about still? Why are we not seeing the results that we should be seeing? Why is this not a non-issue in this day and age, right? And it's not, it is still an issue. So we have to talk about it, I guess.
So, for people who are unfamiliar with this conversation, maybe, like, let's set the scene of what the problem is. So, women, for anyone who doesn't know, are about half of people, but they make up a much smaller percent of the technology workforce and leadership positions at big companies and high earning tech companies. So today, like I hear people say, every company is a tech company nowadays because of the important role that software plays in so many products and services. So do you think that because of that movement forward in our the tech that we develop and offer, are women and people of color in a worse position because of their underrepresentation in technology and STEM jobs?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, right? Like, as you pointed out, women for sure are half the demographic in the world, but they're definitely not half the workforce in tech companies. And yeah, every company is a tech company in the sense that technology is really an integral part of whatever business you're in and literally whatever part of the world we are in, if it's insurance or banking or finance systems, retail. even groceries, you name it, technology is really central to all of this, right? And so are women and people of color worse off in the sense that do we have the equal opportunity at these sorts of roles? I think we are at a disadvantage for many reasons. I think historically, these industries have been primarily, and these disciplines, I would say, technology in general, has been very much male-centric and white male-centric. And I think women were often seen as having soft skills and maybe don't have the right skills to be doing the hard jobs in technology, right? Like engineering and STEM in general, science and technology, was seen as something that was not right for women in particular. And I think the same would apply for people of color. And I think in that sense that we are not there, enough of us are not there at senior levels inside these companies to create a strong pipeline of women and people of color, to make sure the representation exists in all areas inside the companies, in creating products and marketing the products, and understanding what customers want, how do we serve people with our products at all levels in every function. We need to have that right representation, and we're not quite there yet. Yeah.
So you just mentioned this talent pipeline, which is a term that comes up a lot in conversations about representation in tech. And some people say that part of the lack of diversity and representation is that there's not enough people receiving the training and education in these STEM and computer science fields. Other people say, no, that's, an elaborate front for companies who are not willing to usher these people in. What's true, and how much attention do you think the talent pipeline deserves?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely deserves attention, right? Because we want to have more women and people of color entering science and engineering and technology fields, all the way from, I would say, schools into colleges to advanced degrees, and then start careers and hopefully have successful careers. So definitely deserves attention. I think sometimes companies do use it as a crutch to say, it's easy to say, well, we don't have a pipeline, so we're not going to hire women, and we're not going to keep them in the roles. But I think that crutch shouldn't exist. I think there is enough of women and people of color in the pipeline. It's not, we would like to get more, but there is enough for us to be able to recruit. But we have to make an effort to say every job that's posted, we are going to interview, make sure the candidate slate has women and people of color, and it doesn't just, not have representation on the slate. The other thing I think we can do better inside companies is making sure the women and people of color that we do have inside companies have a strong career path to move forward, and that are not leaving the companies at a faster rate, which has happened, unfortunately, during the layoffs. Typically, it's women and people of color that get affected more. They leave the workforce at higher numbers than others. And so those, I think, are other ways we need to work on, in addition to making sure the pipeline is there. How do we retain the people that we do have, the women and people of color we have inside our companies? How do we retain them? How do we develop them? How do we help them grow? How do we give them, the opportunity to rise to the top levels inside these companies?
Yeah, and feel welcome and supported
Exactly.
as they go through that journey. So right now, based on the numbers that I see, about 30% of the tech workforce is women, and about 20% of computer science grads are women. I'm sure there are some people out there who would say that, sounds great. What a success. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, in the computer science, that number, has been the same for the last, I would say, many years. And so while it's okay, I mean, I guess the good news is it hasn't dropped, it hasn't gone up either. And women, by the way, I think there is additional data that says women actually graduate at a higher rate and have better grades than men do in these disciplines. So when we are in those programs, we do better. And so I think that's interesting. And the 30% number is heartening, but it's not, it's not 50%. It should be 50%, right? And so while I think I think what the good news is that this is getting the spotlight it deserves to get. And it's definitely on every company's agenda to get more women and people of color into their workforce and help them develop in their careers. I think that's the good news. When I started my career, that was not even a topic that was discussed. I think so in some sense there's progress, but the results are not quite where they need to be. And so there's still work that needs to get done. I think the other thing, as you pointed out, I think you used the word make them welcome. I think that's just such a key thing. Once I mean, even in my own career, I face this. When you do have, I actually like to talk about a word that I call often I use is belonging versus inclusion. Inclusion means you get a seat at the table, but belonging means that you actually feel like you belong at that table. And I think companies need to start talking not just about inclusion and diversity, but actually how do we make people of color and women feel like they belong in these companies and the cultures, and how do we get to be who we are to be successful. I think that's the next step we need to take in terms of evolving the cultures inside companies.
I love that point because it's so interesting to notice how our language has evolved. Like we used to say tolerance, which now you're like, oh, thanks, and then inclusion, and then your word belonging. And it's easy to see how the question underpinning it all at the end is like, whose table is this?
Right.
And when am I being invited? And when is it mine?
Exactly, right. I mean, there's a huge difference. The words seem like they're small, and sometimes when I talk about, people are like, oh, what's the difference? There is a difference. Diversity to me means you are hiring people that are different from each other. That's great, right? Equity means you're treating them all the same, which is great. Inclusion means everyone gets a seat at the table. You're including me in your culture. Belonging means it's my culture. I'm there shaping it. My voice is heard. I get to play a bigger role in it. I think there is a big difference. And I think what we saw in the last few years with the Me Too movements, Black Lives Matter, it's all about people feeling like they don't belong. You may have invited me to be at the table. You may have asked me for my input, but I was not the one, shaping what the culture should be. It's still being shaped by somebody else. And I'm still sort of like, you're opening the door, but it's not something that I feel like I can be myself to be welcome at. And so I think it is taking that discussion to the next level. I feel that's really, really important these days.
So you are a corporate leader. So this is a little bit outside of your maybe realm of expertise. I don't know. But you've talked about what hiring managers and companies can do and what these training places, like universities and boot camps could do. Any advice for parents and educators? Because at one point you weren't a business leader, you were a little girl with all of this promise as a technologist. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm a parent as well. And, I think I have a son, and I often say my son is more of a feminist than I am. I think, what we do at home, the messages we send at home influence us, right? I think it's our experiences shape. I grew up in India, and our experiences shape who we become as human beings, and who we are as human beings influence who we are as leaders. All these things are intertwined. I often say, when people ask me about balance, I often say, look, I have one life. I don't have a work life and a family life. I have one life. And in that life, I have my work and my family and my personal things that I care about. So my advice to parents, especially if you're a parent raising a child who is not white and who's not male, is like encourage them that their differences actually could be their power. I think in a world where technology is really advancing at a tremendous pace, we need that humanity. We need that human perspective which is not homogeneous, to shape the products that we build. Um, at my company, I'm now an entrepreneur. I've left the corporate world and I'm now a founder of a company. We often say we are a tech company with the soul of an artist. I think it's really important to bring even arts and that perspective about thinking about products from various perspectives, like you would look at a painting from different perspectives. Even that is important. So yeah, I encourage your child to develop that broader perspective, encourage their interest, not just in one field, but in all fields, and bring their true self to whatever they do. I think authenticity is so important more and more in this world.
I love that answer because it's not like, yes, buy your little girl, a coding robot, and that might be it. But it's instill in this little person the idea that wherever they're interested in being, they belong and they have something of value to offer.
Absolutely.
Um, I love that. So you mentioned a minute ago how this recent round of tech layoffs that people may have seen in the headlines disproportionately impacted women and people of color. And I'm sure for a lot of people, especially people in tech who have had all these conversations over the last 3 years about how we can do better. I'm sure it can be very disheartening to hear statistics like that. How can we hold companies accountable to the DEI promises they make in public when behind the scenes it feels like things can fall apart so quickly?
Yeah, I think I mean, part of it's probably part of the layoffs and but also people leaving the workforce. I think even before the layoffs, more women left the workforce voluntarily. Even I think during the lockdown, when we were all working from home, I think there is data that talks about a disproportionate amount of the workload of taking care of your if you're a parent, you're taking care of your children, their schooling at home, your own work, you're on Zoom calls working and taking care of everything that needed to be taken care of at home, or if you have senior parents, caring for them as well as work. A lot of that load and the stress fell more on women and more on families of color than it did others. And I think that itself caused more of a need, I think, for flexibility. And women, I think we, women especially, I can speak to this, feel like we cannot compromise and we hold ourselves to much higher expectations. And I think we work harder in these situations, so we tended to burn out more. I think where companies could have done better is that understanding and not necessarily doing special things for women, but just like saying, I think training their managers to be more empathetic and saying, even I understand what you're going through, right? Like oftentimes that's enough. It's not, I don't think women or people of color are asking companies to go out of their way to accommodate their needs, but it's that understanding and the empathy that I think leading with empathy, leading with compassion, I think making sure we are using those sorts of skill sets to train first level managers, mid-level managers, where a person going through all of this and then having to do with the pressure of the job is just too much and women say, okay, I quit, right? I think that happened a lot right after the pandemic, and we lost more women and people of color voluntarily, and then the layoffs came on top of that. So I think it's like one thing after another that added up, in my opinion.
And I think your point gets at that there's not a single solution. And it's not, and companies aren't the only people who can help or harm. It's the rest of society too helps
Right.
support people as they move into leadership roles. So I think as women in particular, you mentioned perhaps this tendency a lot of women have to hold themselves to this really high standard. I think another thing that I hear people talk about a lot is imposter syndrome. Is feeling like I'm here, but only because no one's noticed yet, or something like that. And for me, a big moment that I had as somebody in the tech industry, a big moment I had with imposter syndrome was when I realized that it's not embarrassing to be stupid or to not know something, and that I I don't have to let people fast talk me. I can just be like, nope, didn't get that, try again. And that was a huge moment for me. I'm curious if you've had anything similar where you're like, oh, like I'm allowed to be here, and here's why.
Absolutely. I think we all have it, and in different ways. I think in my case, it was sort of I'm brown. I came from India. When I came to this country, I'm small. You can see me maybe on Zoom. I'm not as tall, and I think people didn't take me seriously. I think they just felt like even when I was growing into bigger and bigger leadership positions, people always thought of me as a good engineer, and didn't think of me as like someone who has strategy, who can drive the business side of thing. I think usually, by the way, I think we also put people in functional silos. If you're an engineer, you must be a good engineer. If you're a marketer, a good marketer. But can you be a good business leader? And I think it's like you fight these battles on. I had to fight these battles on many fronts. I'm a woman. I'm a brown person, and I'm an engineer. And by the way, I can be a business leader too. And so I think each of these things you feel like you have to knock down, and you always feel, and maybe a lot of women go through this, you always feel like I have to be perfect at everything. I don't get any breaks, or I won't get the chance to move up. And I think you put that pressure on yourself, and you keep, like, the bar keeps rising, and you keep thinking, I'm not good enough. I have to work harder to meet that bar. Yeah, that happens to all of us, right? I think at some point you realize, and I realized in my career, like, okay, forget this. I'm actually better than everybody else in this sense. And I don't need to feel like I have to prove myself at every step of the way. And you get that self-confidence in who you are. And you realize, like, this is my superpower. I'm going to use this superpower to make sure that people recognize this is my strength. And that's the advice I give people, even my own team now, when I coach them. I try to identify for them what I see as their superpower. Sometimes we get blindsided. We don't see our own strengths often, right? And so someone else, and I try to do that when I'm mentoring people and coaching them. I try to point out, hey, I see this as like your superpower. This is so great. You're so good at this. You should always make sure you're holding on to that superpower. You use it, right? Because we all have to learn new things as we grow in careers, but we're also really good at certain things. I think it's just that self-awareness of realizing what you're really good at and acknowledging you're not an imposter. Everybody has to learn something, and that's just normal. It's just not just you that have to learn something new, right? And so, yeah, it's that realization that I think you get somewhere in your career that opens up your eyes. Yeah.
I also love that. I feel like what you said about working with your team, it's totally possible to pull the camera back and remember that when we talk about women or people of color fitting in a tech company, it's not because they are somehow lacking some skill or background to fit in. It's that the context and the water they're swimming in is discounting their strengths, failing to see their strengths, failing to make room for their strengths. And I think that can be helpful to remember too, where it's not that I'm underrepresented because people like me don't cut it. It's because this environment wasn't built for us.
That's right. And it's set in its ways, and it hasn't evolved, right? And maybe it needs to change rather than you changing to fit in. So I think that's what I mean by belonging. Like, the culture needs to adjust, and it needs to be shaped by the people that are coming into the workforce now that are very different and bring a different perspective, versus saying, here's what it is, and this is, by the way, been defined by us by 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and you now have to fit into this culture, and therefore you are made to feel like an imposter. Yeah, it's just a very different. It needs to be more fluid to allow for that new people coming in to shape what that culture is going to be.
So I feel like we've touched on this a couple of times during our conversation, which is that the words we use matter because they influence reality, and then reality influences our words, and it all moves in a big circle. So if there's one thing that you could change about the discourse and the discussions that we're having right now about underrepresented groups in tech and leadership, what would you shift and change?
Yeah, I would definitely I mean, I don't know, this is not to say that DEI are not important, but I would shift the conversation to, and I do this, by the way, when I talk to companies, I force leaders to think about, do you have a culture of belonging? Do you allow people to feel like they belong no matter what they are? You know, maybe my hair color is different from the rest of the people, and that's okay. This is how I want to be, and I want to belong, and I still am invested in the company. Are you fostering that? Versus just checking the box saying I've hired people that are different and therefore I'm okay. So I think we need to shift that conversation. So I'm not necessarily saying replace DEI because we haven't quite gotten that point yet, but I want to introduce the word belonging into people's vocabulary.
And then last question from me, what are companies or even just one company that stood out to you doing that you think is a win and that you think is a step in the right direction?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a one company, but I can think of companies that are doing things, um, I think, differently, which is recognizing that human connections are important. I don't know if you saw, by the way, there's a new report that has just come out from the US Surgeon General's office that talks about how mental wellness, human connections, these things are really, really important. And I think a lot of stress, and I mean, this is the mission of my company too, acknowledging that wellness is holistic and for people to feel like they can they can be connected to others helps us contribute more. So I think companies that are recognizing this, and I actually applaud the US Surgeon General's office for really calling this out, because so much of our work, of our life, is spent at work, right? Working. And if we don't feel like we have those human connections with people who we are working and that culture, so I do feel like some companies are beginning to make this a priority, employee mental wellness. They talk about it openly. They're bringing solutions into the workforce that encourage that. All of these things, I think, will help women and people of color more so, right? Like as we talked about, we probably face more stress than anyone else. And so companies acknowledging that wellness holistically and mental wellness is an important initiative, I think is the right thing to do. And I see more and more companies doing that.
So it sounds like flexibility, belonging, and allowing people to show up as their authentic selves are what you're looking forward to.
Yes, absolutely. Great summary.
Padmasree, thank you so much for your time here today, sharing what you've learned and helping us think through some of these questions. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tatum. Hopefully next year we would have made more progress on this.